Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the Healthicity Compliance presentation, Failure to Comply, Examples of Business Associates Gone Wrong. My name is Justin Larson, and I'll be your facilitator today. A couple of items to mention before we begin. Today's webinar will be about 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. Your line is muted, so if you have questions, please send them via the questions box, or feel free to email your questions after the presentation. Please note that there will not be any CEUs for today's webinar. Also, we will be emailing everyone after the presentation with links to the webinar recording and the presentation slide deck so that you can download it. Our presenter today is CJ Wolf. CJ is a healthcare professional with more than 20 years of experience in a hospital and physician revenue cycle, practice management, compliance, coding, billing, and client services. He has been providing healthcare consulting and solution services to hospitals and physician organizations throughout the country. And now I'll turn the time over to CJ.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you to all of those who are attending today. I appreciate your attendance and your participation. Before we get started with some specifics about business associates and areas and examples of things that have gone wrong, I want to give a little bit of context here. Keep in mind, and many of you probably know this, that HHS is required to post a list of breaches of unsecured PHI that affect 500 or more individuals. And I've provided you a list, the link here of where you can go and you can see that information. I think if you're involved in the area of business associates and HIPAA compliance, this link is really important because it's updated regularly. And what it does is it lists all of these different breaches. Some of them involve business associates, not all of them, but it will provide you some details as to what went wrong. And the reason I wanted to share this with you is I took this list, I downloaded it, and I did a little data analysis, and approximately, to date at least, approximately 15 to 20% of these breaches involve a business associate of some sort. So it's not a small number. It's about 1 in 5 of these breaches that are large, of 500 or more, involve a business associate. So that really, I think, puts into context what we're going to be talking about today. We're talking about a large number, and it's really important that we pay attention to business associates. Now, we know that there are other breaches that occur that are less than 500, that involve less than 500 individuals. That is not necessarily publicly posted on a list here, so we can't run numbers there. But in attending certain conferences recently and in hearing OCR officials' comments, business associate breaches happen obviously with less than 500 individuals involved as well. So it's a very significant issue. So let's talk a little bit about our agenda for today. I'd like to break this down into 3 main points. Number 1, how do you identify who your business associates are? Kind of some of us might think, well, yeah, we know who they are, but there's some nuances there. Second, I'd like to talk about how to assess, once you know who those business associates are, how do you assess which one of those business associates pose the greatest risks? And then third, how do you mitigate those risks once you've identified what they are? You'll have some business associates who might be bigger players, so to speak, in your PHI. Let's say you have an electronic medical record vendor. Obviously, they are a major player and a major business associate as a vendor of EMR, electronic medical record. And you may emphasize your due diligence of them in a different way than, let's say, you have a consultant who is going to provide auditing services for 1 month out of the year, and it's going to be limited to 20 medical records. Still important. We still need to make sure those safeguards in place, but the weight that you place on due diligence there might be a little different than a vendor who is going to involve all of your medical records and is going to be kind of a major player in your electronic, or maybe it's even physical PHI, paper records. So those are the 3 main areas, and let's start by jumping into first identifying business associates. So I wanted to, before we get into some specifics, I wanted to share an example, a pretty recent example of a lack of identifying. It may have been they failed to identify this vendor as a business associate. They at least failed in getting a business associate agreement signed. So this was the Raleigh orthopedic clinic, and this is kind of interesting because they verbally agreed with the third-party vendor. So in or obviously you can think of in orthopedic clinics, there's going to be a lot of radiology films, right? Orthopedic surgeons rely on radiology for much of the services they provide. So this clinic has a stash, so to speak, of hard copy radiology films. Well, those radiology films contain silver. There's a small amount of silver in radiology films. And so this vendor and the clinic had verbally agreed for the vendor to harvest the silver from those radiology films in exchange for transferring all of those X-ray images into an electronic medium. And so they made that verbal agreement, but the clinic turned over all those films before obtaining a written business associate agreement. Obviously, radiology films are going to contain PHI, and you cannot turn over or disclose that PHI to a third party or a business associate without having a written business associate agreement. And this failure, this failure of disclosure or of obtaining a BAA before disclosing involved over 17,000 individuals' PHI. Now, on a side note, I was at a conference recently in Boston a couple of weeks ago, and some OCR officials were there, and they mentioned that they specifically talked about this settlement, and they mentioned that as an unfortunate side event or side note here, the clinic actually got scammed here. The vendor took the films and didn't even provide the service. So in addition to having this HIPAA breach, there were some other unfortunate business ramifications from the event. What happened is OCR investigated here. The clinic eventually had a resolution agreement of $750,000. There was also a corrective action plan that we're going to talk about. But what I wanted to share with you is specifically in regards to this clinic's incident, the director of HHS OCR, Jocelyn Samuels, said this: HIPAA's obligation on covered entities, which is the clinic, to obtain business associate agreements is more than a mere check-the-box paperwork exercise. It is critical for entities to know to whom they are handing PHI and to obtain assurances that the information will be protected. So a lot of times I think in the rush of the day and with the heavy workload that many compliance and privacy and security officers have, they think, okay, do we have a business associate agreement? That's obviously important, because if you don't have one and you disclose the PHI, you've violated some of these regulations. But what we're going to talk about a little bit as well is not just getting that BAA in place, but also, have you vetted that vendor? Have you done some due diligence? Now, that may not be a black and white requirement in the HIPAA regulations, but keep in mind what we'll talk about for the next little while is there's the HIPAA regulations, things that you have to follow that you can be fined for, or there may be a settlement. But then you also have other reputational risks that your organization may have. So those aren't necessarily ruled by OCR. Those are things that you're wanting to protect your reputation as an organization, as well as you may have to have other costs associated with investigations, hiring attorneys, or hiring forensic firms, and hiring credit monitoring firms. These things are not necessarily requirements of HIPAA, but they're things that generally follow breaches, and there are additional costs. So it behooves all of us to vet our business associates and not just treat it as a paper exercise, as Ms. Samuel says, and just checking the box, yes, I have a business associate agreement, though that is a very key first step. So in the corrective action plan for this particular clinic, and we're going to talk about a few items that were brought about in this corrective action plan, not just during this first item, but later on in the presentation. But as it relates to business associate agreements, one of the things in the corrective action plan was you're going to have to send us a list of all your business associates. Now, it sounds common sense that we should all be able to do this, but I would challenge most of us and ask yourself this question, look yourself in the mirror and say, can I easily produce a list of all my business associates? It's not easily done. And though you might have some centralized function, when entities like departments or certain areas within an organization come to the legal department or come to the compliance department proactively and say, hey, I'm going to have a relationship with this third-party vendor, will you help me with the business associate agreement? Or you might have a policy that they're required to do that. That doesn't mean that they all do, right? So in the case of this clinic, maybe there was a centralized compliance program and they had policies that said before you enter into any disclosure of PHI, you must have a business associate agreement. But if there's a part of the organization that's going to engage a business partner without following that policy, then you've engaged a business associate and you haven't gotten a business associate agreement. So keep in mind there's these silos often, and sometimes the larger your organization is, the more those silos exist. And so just getting your arms around all your business associates can be a big task. But this was one of the requirements in the corrective action plan for this clinic, is they had to send a current list of all their business associates and then a copy of all the business associate agreements. So that can be a lot of work if these are housed in many different areas. And so one of the best practices, in my opinion, is to keep this centralized and have one person or one department responsible for all your business associate agreements. Now, one other thing that the corrective action plan required was that the clinic had to review all of their HIPAA policies and procedures, not just in regards to their HIPAA compliance, but specifically how they manage the business associate vetting process. So I think most of us have policies and procedures surrounding HIPAA, but do you have something that's specific to the vetting of a business associate? So hopefully in your policies, when you say, yes, we require all of our third-party vendors who are going to store, create, or transmit PHI, they all must have a business associate agreement. Well, maybe you have now an addendum to that policy that specifically discusses how you're going to vet that business associate. Okay, that was something that I found very interesting in this corrective action plan. So having a policy or a procedure in vetting those business associates. So let's move on to a second example, and this was Oregon Health Sciences University, and this was a settlement a little while ago, but it did involve one of the incidents involved not having a business associate agreement. So oftentimes when OCR investigates, they may find multiple issues, and the settlement encompasses all of those issues, and that's the case here. So I don't want to give you the impression that this settlement was only because there was not a business associate agreement, but it was a major part of this investigation and settlement. So the issue was that residents, so physicians who are in residency training, they were using Google Docs to store some documents containing PHI of over 3,000 individuals, and over 1,300 of those had very sensitive diagnoses. And there was no BAA in place, so Google Docs they're not going to sign a business associate agreement. There was even a policy in place restricting this practice, but supervisors were not enforcing it. So as opposed to a single rogue employee that maybe violated the policy, that wasn't the case here. At the conference that I attended a couple weeks ago, the OCR official said that supervisors and managers knew of this practice, so they knew it was going on, but they did not enforce the policy. So that's much different than having a single rogue employee violating company policy. This was more of a, they were going to flat out ignore the policy that's in place, and many people in authority knew that this was going on. And so that's a major issue. And so, I mean, kind of common sense though. You have a policy not to do X, but are you monitoring your policy? As we all know, one of the 7 elements of an effective compliance program is internal monitoring and auditing. So you have a policy to not do that, but are you doing any proactive auditing and monitoring and enforcing those policies? That was a key issue here. Now, Ms. Samuels said something very important in regards to this resolution as well. She said OHSU should have addressed the lack of a business associate agreement before allowing a vendor to store EPHI. This settlement underscores the importance of leadership engagement and why it is so critical for the C-suite to take HIPAA compliance seriously. Now, what I think is important about this quote is, as a former compliance officer, oftentimes I'm dealing with the board of directors or with a chief executive officer, the CEO, or an executive compliance committee. They don't necessarily have time to sit on this webinar for an hour and hear all these details, right? But one good takeaway that I think you could take if you have to engage with senior leadership of some sort, this one quote I think would be really important, is to share as you do your training of your executives and of your board and directors, that the C-suite is expected to take HIPAA compliance seriously. So this one little snippet might be very valuable in that regard, because this settlement had to do with their involvement or lack thereof. So one other thing I want to talk about when it comes to business associates and identifying who they are, it can be a little bit complex. So I wanted to share with you a couple examples, and there's many examples, but here are a couple of decision trees that you can follow to try to find the answer of, am I a business associate or am I not? So there's examples where, here's one example. Let's say you have house cleaning staff or janitorial staff for your clinic. Are they a business associate? Well, no, not really. If you follow through this, generally they're not going to be, because if you follow through this kind of decision tree, you're going to find out they don't transmit, store, or create PHI for you. Now, they may come across incidentally a paper chart that's left on a physician's desk or something. So you might want to have confidentiality agreements in place, but they're not a business associate. And so working through those decisions and working through that logic, it can be helpful to use this sort of decision tree. And then here's another example of decision trees. The reason I share these is these are very complex, and in a few weeks we're going to actually talk about how software can help you simplify that whole process. And we have an example of software that we're going to go through and show you how embedding those questions into software to automatically store the answers and automatically register somebody as a business associate versus not registered as a business associate can be very helpful. And that helps you get your arms around all of those potential business associates. So step 1 was identifying business associates. Step 2 is, now that you've identified them, how can you thoughtfully go about assessing which business associates have the greatest risk? So I'm going to share with you a few examples of where things may have gone wrong, and then I'm going to provide a list of questions that can be thought of as due diligence or vetting when you are considering business associates. This headline was interesting because it was actually an auditing firm that was auditing. They were a HIPAA auditor. So if anyone's going to know the rules and the regulations and best practices, it's typically going to be a good HIPAA auditor. So it can even happen to those people who are very well versed in these regulations. But what happened in this scenario was there was an unencrypted flash drive that this HIPAA auditor used, and it exposed more than 4,500 patient records when it was lost. Interestingly, OCR eventually used this same vendor to provide some HIPAA audit requirements that they were doing. The breach occurred before, the loss of this flash drive occurred before for a different client, another health system, but then OCR eventually used this same auditing firm. So when we're sharing some of these examples, it can happen to all of us. So this is not necessarily meant to be, a punitive type of exercise, but rather we can learn from these types of mishaps. Another example was KPMG, and with a different covered entity. This was Newark Beth Israel Medical Center, and this employee of KPMG, who was a business associate for Beth Israel, they lost another. This was a different scenario, a different circumstance, but same kind of story. Lost an unencrypted USB drive that contained EPHI of almost 1,000 individuals. The covered entity provided breach notification to HHS, and keep in mind, when it's over 500, you also have to report to the local media that this has happened, and then also to the affected individuals. So as a result of this particular investigation in this scenario, the business associate installed and implemented encryption software to its electronic equipment and devices. So what's really important, and then you can see as well that they reprimanded and retrained the particular employee that was involved. So what I like the content of this slide, it shows that in addition to having a business associate agreement, some of the questions you're going to want to ask are, do you train your employees, business associate? Do you keep track of that training? The software, the flash drives and the laptops that your employees will use, Mr. Business Associate, will they be encrypted? So these are some of the questions you can ask when you're vetting, and I'm going to show you those questions. I have a list of those questions. But I wanted to show you examples of where things went wrong and why I'm going to provide you with certain questions. This next example is the University of Pennsylvania. And what I wanted to bring up in this context is, keep in mind, the business associate will have some obligations under the HIPAA regulations, and they'll be held accountable. But unfortunately, it's your reputation, right? So the patients aren't being seen by the business associate, they're being seen by your hospital or your health system. So part of what you're trying to do here is protect your own reputation. This is an example of where it was the business associate's error, but the University of Pennsylvania health system, they're the ones who had to announce it, right? They're the ones that had to put something on their website and say, our business associate did X, Y, and Z. So it still taints the organization a little bit and affects them, even though it was the business associate's error. So in this example, the business associate was RevSpring. It involved 3,000 individuals PHI, and it was a printing error. So this was more, instead of electronic EPHI, it was paper records. And it was a simple printing error, and patients received billing statements containing other patients' protected health information. And that breach included names, account numbers, procedure codes, dates of service, etc. So following the breach, the covered entity obtained assurances from its business associate that safeguards were implemented to prevent future disclosures. Now, the reason I share this is because that's great. They did this after the fact. What I'm going to show you are questions you can ask before you engage that business associate so you obtain assurances from the business associate that they have safeguards. You do that after the fact. It makes sense for all of us to try to do and obtain those assurances from our business associates before we disclose our PHI to them. So here's another example. Again, this is an anesthesiology group practice. I'm showing you this because this is their website, right? Now, same story. It was their business associate who made the error, but this is what they had to put on their own website, okay, to alert their patients that one of their business partners made an error, and now we have to go through these different procedures. Excuse me. So this is the letter that they actually posted. You can see they post some brief facts as to what happened, that on April 18th, we were notified by our website hosting company. So it was their hosting company as the business associate that had the problem, but it was their practice's PHI that gets disclosed. So you can see the different things they're doing, the nature of the data accessed, steps you can take to protect yourself. They had to hire, this is step number 3, they had to hire, they hired Identity Force, a firm that specializes in identity theft protection. And then there are benefits. You can sign up for benefits to have your credit monitored and those sorts of things. Well, that costs money, okay, and that comes from somewhere. And so this whole process is a pain for the covered entity. So the point I'm trying to make over and over again is let's vet these scenarios beforehand and catch as much of it as we can up front. Are we going to be able to prevent every breach? No, right? There's no way to prevent every error, but let's do the best we can before we turn over our PHI. That's the message I'm trying to share. So in this scenario, the name of the business associate was E-dreamz. Again, almost 1,000 patients, excuse me, almost 10,000 patients' credit card information was compromised. The covered entity provided the breach notification to HHS and the media and affected individuals. That's one thing that sometimes when I'm struggling with upper management and getting resources, I can say, you know, if we have a breach, keep in mind if it's over 500, not only do we have to disclose to HHS, we have to alert the local media. And they sometimes will then run stories and run in the newspaper or in TV news, and they'll be naming us, and it'll just be bad press for us. So keep that in mind. They also offered a year of free credit monitoring. So somebody has to pay for that, and that's a headache. So here are some of the other issues with E-dreamz. They had to hire an outside forensic computer specialist to investigate. The last bullet here is eventually the covered entity terminated its service agreement with the business associate and entered in with a different web hosting vendor. Okay. So another example, North Shore, Long Island Jewish warns about 18,000 patients of potential data breach. This again came from a business associate. 5 laptops were stolen from the offices of the global care delivery firm, which was their business associate. Now what's interesting here is these were unencrypted laptops. They were stolen. They contained about 18,000 patients' PHI, diagnoses, treatment codes. And what I find interesting in this next slide, the business associate notified the police at the time of the theft, but they didn't notify the covered entity until much later, which was, in this case, it was May of 2015. So one of the things I'm going to share with you in my questions here is, you know, does your business associate have a notification process? They should be notifying the covered entity right away as well, not just the police that the laptops were stolen. In this instance, the business relationship between the covered entity and the business associate ended on the same day that they were notified. And in this case, the business associate closed its business. So another example, this one I thought was interesting because this was an optometrist, and they were sharing physical office space with another optometrist, but when that relationship ended, the one optometrist allegedly took all the data from the database so that that physician could solicit patients for her own practice. So that got reported, and it occurred in December of 13, affected about 4,000 individuals. The EPHI involved lots of information: social security numbers, names, driver's license, dates of birth, bank account numbers, so a lot of information there. The covered entity provided breach notification to HHS. Following the breach, this covered entity installed computer firewalls, and based on OCR's technical assistance, the covered entity notified the media and completed a risk assessment. At the end here, the last sentence, you can see the covered entity improved physical safeguards as well by moving the computer with the EPHI behind a 5-foot tall counter. So remember, there are administrative, physical, and technical safeguards that are required to be in place for PHI. And this last one, before I get to our questions that I'm going to provide for you, is a pharmacy example where the law firm, they were using a law firm because of a complaint, and the pharmacy chain disclosed PHI of a customer of the pharmacy chain. When OCR investigated the allegation, they found no evidence that the law firm had impermissibly disclosed the customer's PHI, but they did not have a BAA in place. So even a law firm that's going to be helping you with something, if you're going to be disclosing PHI to that law firm, you have to have a business associate agreement in place. Okay, so that's a key thing to remember as well. Oh, I apologize. There's one last one here before the questions. So this was an example of where OCR came down and enforcement action against the business associate themselves. This was a business associate of multiple nursing homes. I believe it was in the Philadelphia area, yes, Catholic Health Care Services. And they settled for about $650,000. This was one of the first examples that I saw of the business associate itself being held accountable in such a large way. This is a pretty large settlement. And they also, this business associate also had a corrective action plan. Okay, so with all of those examples, what can we glean from that? I share those examples, like I said, to kind of give you some questions that we can ask in due diligence. So one of the first questions I would ask if I'm going to potentially engage a vendor as a business associate is, okay, business associate, when did you perform your last risk analysis? Okay, when was it done? What were the results? What reasonably anticipated threats to ePHI and system vulnerabilities were identified? So you did this analysis. What kinds of things did you identify? Maybe I ask, what were the top 3? You can change that number, obviously, it's arbitrary. Top 10, top 5. And then, okay, BA, what mitigation steps have you taken to identify these risks and to mitigate them? So again, this might be a kind of due diligence that you do with, let's say, your top 20 business associates, as far as, and when I say top 20, those business associates that have the greatest access to your PHI. Okay, you might not be able to do this for every single business associate, but those that are going to pose the greatest risks, these might be good questions to ask. Does the BA have a written privacy policy? Are employees required to attest to policy annually? So the example that I used of that auditing firm, KPMG, and that employee, you know, one of the things that they did after the breach is they retrained that employee. Well, you know, what training do you do beforehand? So instead of waiting until a breach occurs, let's ask our business associates, do you have policies? Are you doing training? Do you have, excuse me, do you have privacy officers? Are they, you know, what level or what? Sometimes business associates may name somebody as a privacy or security officer in name only, and they're doing 14 other duties. And so are they really focused on their work as somebody in HIPAA compliance? So these same questions for security. So policy for privacy as well as security policies. Do you have a security officer? You know, what kind of level is that employee? What position do they hold? Is it full-time, part-time? Those kinds of questions. Other questions. Does the BA require employees to complete HIPAA training? Is completion of this training documented? So if they answer yes, we require it, I say, well, would you mind showing us some of your documents of training? You know, show us where it's been documented. Let's see how thorough the training is. Must the training be completed before the employee is given access to functions that expose PHI? Those kinds of questions. Has the BA proactively had an independent third-party audit of their HIPAA compliance program? Now, this is probably unlikely for some of the smaller business associates that you have, but if you're going to have a major electronic medical record vendor involved, and obviously that vendor makes their living off of electronic medical records for many clients. You're not the only client. There's going to be hundreds or thousands. If that's all they do for a living, you would probably expect that a company that does that is going to probably have an independent third-party audit. It would make sense for me to ask a major vendor like that to demonstrate, okay, what due diligence are you doing, vendor? This is your bread and butter. PHI is embedded in everything that you do as a business, so how seriously do you take privacy and security? And so you could ask them, what did that third party find? When was it done? What were the results? What were the top 3 areas identified, et cetera, et cetera. Penetration testing, also very important. You know, that might have been a good one for the example of the anesthesia practice that I showed you that had their web hosting company got hacked. You know, maybe before I engaged in a relationship with that web hosting company, I would say, have you ever had penetration testing performed? And if so, what were the results? Okay, those types of due diligence and questions we can ask beforehand. Encryption, what are the encryption levels? Are all portable devices encrypted? Mobile phones, laptops, tablets, etc., flash drives. What is the documented communication plan if contacted by OCR? So what are you going to do, and what is your documented plan for a breach? How are you going to alert us? What's our agreement going to be? We need to think through those things because breaches can happen even with the best preparation. And so we need to think, if one happens, how quickly are they going to alert us? What are the physical security standards for all the sites? What are the written procedures for compliant destruction of PHI? So thinking ahead of, okay, when we end our relationship with this vendor, you have to think ahead. What's your written procedure for destroying all PHI or returning, okay, if it's maybe paper records? Okay, so our third area is, once you've identified some of those risks, how can you mitigate some of them? And just basically, here are some major buckets and concepts to think about. First of all, assess your business associates' preparedness and exposure, due diligence. That's kind of what we just talked about. The second thing, though, is you can have contractual protections. So you might business associate agreement to cover your that regulation with HIPAA, but contractually, you might also want to work with your legal departments to make sure that you put in certain provisions. If there is a breach, you're going to cover the free credit monitoring that we offer to the people, other than the hospital. So if it's my business associate's fault and there's a major issue, why should I, as the hospital, have to pay for that? Now, if you don't put those kinds of provisions and have those kinds of discussions ahead of time, you as the hospital or you as the covered entity might get stuck with those type of things, because that's what patients are going to expect. The other important thing is specificity of tasks and requirements. So in your statement of work, get very specific in what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. So I'm going to jump back to our Raleigh Orthopedic Clinic corrective action plan, because there were some things in there that help mitigate risks. Number one, they suggested that the clinic create a standard template business associate agreement. Okay. Number two, maintain documentation of business associate agreements for at least 6 years beyond the termination date of the relationship. So where are you going to store all those? Where are they going to be ready for you when that is asked for? And then here's a key point, number three, limit disclosures of PHI to business associates to the minimum necessary. So keep in mind, just because you have a business associate agreement in place, you still should only, business associates should only be obtaining the minimum necessary PHI required in order for them to do the task that they've been you've agreed upon for them to do. So if they don't need access to the full medical record, they shouldn't be given access to the full medical record. If they just need codes and billing codes and those sorts of things, then that's the minimum necessary that they need to perform their function. So that's a really important aspect of this. And that was in their corrective action plan. Now, OCR has business associate contracts and sample business associate agreements on their website, so I provided that link for you. We have examples as well. I want to talk briefly just about Advocate, because this was a recent settlement, and it's, I believe, the largest financial settlement that OCR has made to date with a covered entity, and it was $5.55 million. Now, again, they had many issues, but one of them involved a business associate, and that's the one I want to talk about. It was with a consulting group called Blackhawk Consulting Group, and they provided billing services to Advocate. So EPHI of over 2,000 patients had been potentially compromised when an unauthorized third party accessed Blackhawk's network. So I was at another conference about a year ago where the head of the FBI cyber division came to speak to us, and he spoke about the value of healthcare information, patient information on the open market, on the street value, so to speak, as opposed to like a credit card number. And I forget the exact numbers, but it was about, I think credit card numbers were worth about $1 to $2 on the street, whereas health information was worth $20 to $40, because more fraud can be committed when some of that information was available. So I thought that was very interesting. So the business we are in and the PHI and the other protected information we have is very valuable on the street. And so making sure that those that we entrust with the PHI have done their due diligence is important. So the third bullet here is Advocate failed to obtain satisfactory assurances in the form of a written business associate contract from Blackhawk, as required by the regulations. They also had a corrective action plan, and I pulled out one key aspect that I think could be helpful in mitigating some risks. They required in the corrective action plan that Advocate designate one or more individuals who are responsible for ensuring that Advocate enters into a business associate agreement with each of its business associates. Common sense, maybe, but if you don't assign it to somebody, the first step to failure is there's not a listed name or a listed party who is accountable for that. When accountability is assigned, those individuals or that department feel the weight of that responsibility, and then at least you know where to go when there's a failure to say, look, this was assigned to you, this was your responsibility. So I think that's a really good mitigating step in our organizations, is to name the individual or name the department that's responsible for ensuring that all business associate agreements are in place. This particular corrective action plan also required an independent third-party reviewer hiring. They had to hire an independent third-party reviewer to assess compliance, and included in the list of things that independent third-party reviewer had to do, interviewing business associates as needed was specifically listed in the corrective action plan. And then it's important to maintain and track a detailed log of reportable events. That was a requirement of their corrective action plan, is that they had some sort of system and way of maintaining and tracking all of those reportable events and what they did with each one. So at this point, we are going to turn the time over to you to ask some questions. As usual, if you have questions after the session, the webinar, feel free to email me directly and I can address some of those questions. But if you have any now that you think you'd like to ask, please feel free to type them in the question box. Okay, here's one that I think is very pertinent. Somebody's asking, you mentioned paper records or hard copy records. What percent or what portion of breaches involve paper records or hard copy? That's a good question, because you know, we're moving into a much more digital age, right? And you think at this point in time that no one would be using paper anymore, but that's not necessarily true. Healthcare is moving in that direction, but it's not fully there. A colleague of mine actually did a little data analysis for the year of 2015. My colleague's name is Paul Hales. He's a HIPAA attorney, and he and I were discussing this recently. In 2015, at least the breaches that are publicly reportable, about 40% involves paper records or hard copy records. So the example that we used in today's webinar of the Raleigh Clinic, you know, those were films, right? They were hard copy films, so they weren't digitized yet. So about 40%, and that's still a lot. So we have to, EPHI is important, but we also have to keep in mind that you can't forget the paper side of things, unfortunately. Here's another question. How often is HIPAA training required for staff? Well, so I'm not aware of a law or a regulation that specifically says a date, but I can tell you what best practices are. Most organizations require it at least annually, and in some of these corrective action plans, so once you've gotten into trouble and you've signed a corrective action plan or some sort of agreement, many times those agreements specifically state it must be annually, and so that's really important. I'm glad you asked the question, because training staff is a really important part of this. A lot of times we think, okay, let's get our computer systems encrypted and our laptops, and let's get everything you know, locked down from an electronic place. And as I've talked to IT experts, the major point of weakness in all of this is humans, right? You've heard of phishing attacks and ransomware. Oftentimes that's when you know, there's emails sent to individuals in your organization, and they click on a link or they download a file of some sort, and then you get these ransomwares and those sorts of things. And that's a human interaction there, right? So the system was safeguarded until a human clicked on something. And so the training piece is a really important piece. So I'm glad you bring that up. At least annually is the best practice. And then I think some exercises in between are good. I've worked for organizations where the IT folks will send out practice phishing emails saying, hey, click on this. And then if you click on it, it'll say, hey, we're your IT department. You shouldn't have clicked on this. And those types of exercises are good because you're actually then getting out to the workforce to actually practice some of the things that you trained on in your annual training. Here's another question. If a business associate or BA has a breach, who is OCR going to hold accountable? So that's a really good question. So as we all know, as of 2013, business associates are held accountable to the same regulations that covered entities are as it pertains to them. And this question was actually asked when I was at this conference a few weeks ago. Of OCR, and OCR said, look, if you have a valid business associate agreement in place, you know, that those errors, if the business associate makes an error, that's going to be on them, okay? But keep in mind, OCR is looking at this from the perspective of what the regulations say. So that may be true that OCR would hold the business associate accountable, but who are your patients going to hold accountable? Okay, so that's who OCR will hold accountable. But part of what I'm trying to share today is that you have your reputation to be thinking about as well, not just OCR. As you know, as a compliance officer, reputational risk is also it was something that was on my mind, and actually I included it in our risk analysis when we did our compliance program risk assessment each year. Was reputationally, what could this mean? And so patients are going to say, Okay, fine, it was your business associate that had the breach, but you're the one who hired the business associate. Didn't you do X, Y, and Z to make sure they were a good business partner? And so you might have the business associate agreement in place, but and that might help you from an OCR perspective, but you still want to make sure that you've done some due diligence and vetting so that you can protect your patients the best possible way. Interestingly, when OCR answered that question, they also said, sure, we're going to hold the business associate responsible, but you as an organization had better done what they called a sniff test. And I think the speaker used the example of, you know, if you're trying to sign a contract with Joe's Automotive Repair and clouds and internet cloud services, if that's the name of the company, then you might want to that sniff test might not pass, or you might want to do a little due diligence if this company does automotive repair and hosts cloud services. So that just drills home the point of what we've been talking about due diligence and vetting. And here we have time for one last question. This question is, what if your business associate has a breach? Do they pay for credit monitoring? So that was also actually asked of OCR, and OCR said, look, we're not involved in that. That's not a part of these requirements. That's going to be between you and your business associate. And so that drills home, for me, that drilled home the point of, okay, OCR is looking at it from a very focused perspective of these regulations. We as compliance officers need to be thinking about things from the perspective of, how do I protect my organization ultimately? Does that include OCR perspective? Absolutely, I need to include that perspective, but I need to include the perspective of, and your question is a good one, credit monitoring, of who's going to pay for that. And so if that would be something that I'd want to vet during my business associate negotiations, so to speak. You might not always put that into some sort of contractual provision, but if it's a large business associate and they have a lot of access to your PHI, that might be something to consider, because if the breach is their fault, are you, the hospital, going to pay for it? So excellent questions. And with that, we're out of time for the day, and so I'm going to turn the time back over to Justin. I thank all of you for participating today.
Yes, and thanks to you, CJ, for the great presentation, and also to everyone for attending today. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to direct them to CJ directly at cj.wolf@healththecity.com. If we weren't able to get to your question today during the presentation, we invite you to subscribe to the Health the City blog. We will be answering the questions taken in today's webinar in upcoming blog posts. And we just launched a poll that you should be able to see on your screen now. If you would, please rate how informative this webinar was on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the best. These polls do help us to improve our webinars, and we greatly appreciate your feedback on those. Again, we will be emailing everyone with an on-demand recording of the presentation that we just had, as well as a link to download the slide deck. So just keep an eye out on your email inbox to get those links. And thank you all again.